I stood before the memory of a world already lost when the story truly began, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear Valyria breathing beneath its mantle of fire. In those distant ages, long before Dragonstone became my refuge, the freehold stretched across the eastern continent like a great shimmering crown. 40 noble families commanded it, each bound to dragons born from the burning veins of the 14 flames. Yet, even among such magnificence, I remember clearly how far beneath the others my own bloodline stood. House Targaryen was small, almost forgettable, a single spark in a storm of fire. Still, destiny has a peculiar way of choosing its instruments. I did not know it then, but the fall of empires often begins in whispers rather than thunder. When my forebears lived in Valyria, dragons soared above cities, sculpted from stone, melted and reshaped by magic older than any written word. The ground trembled with power, and the sky shimmered with heat rising from the volcanic range that had birthed the freehold itself. It was a civilization unmatched, a realm where knowledge, sorcery, and steel interwove into a brilliance the world had never seen again. But even as I speak these words to you now, I recall the lesson carved into my lineage. Greatness is fragile when built upon the illusion of permanence. The freehold believed itself eternal. That arrogance turned to ash in a single day. The prophecy began in the quiet of a young girl's sleep. Daenerys Targaryen, daughter of my ancestor who ruled then, dreamed of a world drowning in fire. She saw mountains exploding, dragons screaming as flame consumed them, and cities collapsing into the sea. She saw death not as a shadow but as a tide. When she woke trembling, her father did not dismiss her words as the fantasies of a frightened child. He gathered our family, gathered what few dragons we possessed, and abandoned the freehold for a lonely island fortress in the narrow sea, Dragonstone, a place bleak and foreboding, carved with volcanic stone that still seemed warm long after the fires died. At the time it seemed a retreat. In truth it was salvation. The doom came with a fury I cannot fully convey, for even memory recoils from it. The 14 flames erupted at once, tearing the earth open like a wound. Entire mountains split into molten torrents. Ash blotted out the sun. Rivers boiled in their beds. The proud towers of Valyria collapsed as if kneeling to an unseen conqueror. Dragons, the very symbol of the freehold's might, fell burning from the sky. There was no warning beyond Daenerys' dream, no mercy, no time for escape. In a single day, the greatest power on earth vanished, leaving only smoking ruin where ambition once flourished. When word reached Dragonstone, disbelief gave way to grief, and grief to a silent understanding. My family survived not by strength or cunning, but by heeding a vision no one else had. In the aftermath, the Valyrian colonies splintered into independent city-states, each scrambling to survive without the freehold's protection. But we on Dragonstone stood apart, not in glory, but in isolation. We possessed dragons still, though far fewer than the freehold once commanded. We possessed knowledge passed down through careful memory, and more importantly, we possessed the unmistakable truth that fate had intervened. Every house, every kingdom, every lord across the world assumed our survival was chance. I came to believe otherwise. When the past burns away so completely, what remains must be meant for something greater. I tell you these things not to kindle fear or awe, but because you must understand the weight of what preceded me. Valyria's fall was not merely the end of an age, it was the forge that shaped my inheritance. Everything I would eventually do, every decision, Every conquest, every scar arose from the ashes left behind by that single catastrophic day. When I stood upon the black stone battlements of Dragonstone years later, I often felt the wind whistle through the carved dragon heads as if carrying the voices of those who had perished. They reminded me of a truth I could never escape. I was alive because an empire had died, and survival, when granted at such a price, demands purpose. I came into the world on Dragonstone beneath skies the color of forged steel, and from the moment I first opened my eyes, I felt the island watching me. Its cliffs, carved by ancient fire, seemed to breathe with the memories of a civilization that had perished so that I might live. Those who raised me believed my birth signaled a turning point, though they would not say it aloud. I felt it too, even as a child. There was a restlessness inside me, a calling that hummed like distant wings beating through stone walls. Dragonstone was refuge, but it was never meant to be our final home, and deep within, I sensed that my life would not be spent in quiet waiting, but in shaping a world that had forgotten the meaning of fire. My sisters grew beside me, bound by blood and destiny. Visenya, the elder, carried discipline in her voice and steel in her gaze. She trained with a sword long before others thought it proper, and each time I watched her strike, I saw a future queen carved from shadow and iron. Rhaenys, the younger, was woven from gentler threads, though her heart burned just as fiercely. She moved through halls with a curiosity that made the island feel alive, and her laughter softened the cold stone. Together, we were a triad, different in nature, but united in purpose long before any of us understood what that purpose would become. I grew quickly into the weight of my name, for on Dragonstone names mattered more than titles. Aegon, the island, whispered it back to me whenever I walked the battlements. I learned history, strategy, and the stories of kings far across the narrow sea, not because I sought a throne, but because something inside compelled me to understand the world beyond the horizon. Each morning I studied maps until the ink blurred beneath my eyes. Each night I stood on the cliffs, staring west toward a land whose rulers knew nothing of me, yet whose fates were already entwined with mine. I never felt fear in those moments, only certainty. Everything I needed was already within my grasp, waiting for the moment I would reach for it. The dragons were my true teachers. Balerion was already older than memory when I first approached him, his scales dark as nightfall and his breath thick with ancient heat. Others trembled, but I felt recognition ripple between us as if he had been waiting for me. When he allowed me to touch him, the world shifted. The air tasted sharper. My heartbeat slowed. I understood then that dragons were not weapons. They were a covenant between power and will. Visenya bonded with Vhagar, whose roar shook the very stones. Rhaenys chose Meraxes, swift and silver. Together, we formed a force unlike anything the world had seen since Valyria's fall. Not an echo of the freehold, but something new, something shaped by loss and destiny rather than empire and arrogance. As my understanding deepened, so did my vision. I carved a great map of Westeros upon the painted table, each river and mountain sculpted with precision, not for glory, but for preparation. I studied the kings who reigned there, their strengths, their rivalries, their fragile alliances. They fought each other endlessly, believing their crowns secure while their borders smoldered with old grudges. I saw a continent divided not by identity but by fear, and in that fear I saw opportunity, not to conquer in cruelty, but to forge unity from 7 splintered realms. I knew none would yield freely. Real change never comes from comfort. but with dragons above me and purpose before me, I felt the path unfold in clarity. The world beyond the waves was not meant to remain fractured. It was meant to kneel, not to my name alone, but to a future stronger than any kingdom, standing alone. Years passed, yet the certainty within me did not fade. When envoys from Westeros sought alliances, marriages, or bargains cloaked in courtesy, I saw through them. They wished to use us as pieces in their games, never sensing that we were preparing to reshape the board entirely. I refused each offer, not in hostility, but because I already knew the shape of the fate awaiting us all. My sisters understood. Visenya sharpened her blade. Rhaenys sharpened her resolve. And I sharpened my purpose. When the moment finally arrived, it did not come with trumpets or ceremony. It came with a decision spoken aloud on the wind-swept heights of Dragonstone. I declared that the age of waiting was over. The world that had risen from Valyria's ashes was ready to be remade. And I, Aegon of House Targaryen, would carry fire across the sea not as a destroyer, but as a unifier. With my sisters beside me and dragons soaring above, I stepped toward the dawn of conquest, certain that the horizon itself would bend before the will that drove me forward. I crossed the narrow sea with a force so small that any sensible ruler would have laughed had they known my numbers. Fewer than 3,000 soldiers followed me, men and women hardened by loyalty rather than lavish promises. Yet as our ships cut through the dark waves, I felt no fear. Strength is not always measured in the count of spears, but in the resolve that carries them forward. Behind us, Dragonstone shrank into a ghostly silhouette. Ahead lay Westeros, vast and fractured, a land I had studied for years and would now touch for the first time. When our fleet reached the mouth of the Blackwater, dawn broke across the sky like a blade drawn from flame. The shore was quiet, untouched by war, as if waiting for my foot to press into its sand. I stepped down first, felt the weight of destiny settle on the earth beneath me, and planted my banner in the soil. A black field, a red three-headed dragon, fire made flesh, claiming its foothold. That moment, simple yet absolute, marked the birth of what the world would later call the Conquest. I did not need to shout. The land heard me. We fortified the 3 hills rising above the shoreline, though at that time they were nameless mounds of earth surrounded by marsh. I claimed the highest for myself and left the other 2 to my sisters. We raised palisades of wood, crude yet sufficient, for the true strength of our arrival soared above us. Balerian's shadow swept across the field like a night tide. Vhagar and Meraxes followed, their cries shaking the air. The small folk who lived nearby fled at the sight, while the lords who claimed dominion over this region hesitated in confusion. They had never seen dragons in flight. They did not yet realize how drastically the world had changed overnight. The first clashes came sooner than expected. Lords who believed my landing a provocation marched against me with confidence born from habit. They had fought each other for generations. They believed they could simply sweep aside another invader. But they misjudged not only my purpose, but the nature of the fire that accompanied me. When their soldiers approached, I rode Balerion into the sky, his wings unfurled with a force that bent the wind around us, and his roar rolled across the battlefield like distant thunder. I watched the enemy lines falter, their courage wavering beneath the weight of what they could not understand. I did not need to burn them all. A single blast of flame shattered their resolve. The ground itself seemed to remember Valyria in that instant. Those who survived fled or bent the knee, for I offered mercy as readily as destruction. Kneel and you keep your lands. Resist and you face fire. I promised only what I could deliver. Nearby strongholds fell with little struggle. At Rosby, the gates opened before Rhaenys even commanded Meraxes to circle overhead. At Stokeworth, a scattering of arrows attempted to challenge Visenya, but their defiance lasted only moments. Vagar's flames licked across the rooftops, and the defenders surrendered before the smoke had time to rise. These victories were not triumphs of bloodshed, but confirmations of truth. The lords of Westeros saw that the world they knew no longer belonged to the strongest swords, but to the will capable of commanding dragons. Yet, even as we expanded our hold on the region, I felt the weight of the greater challenge looming beyond the hills. Powerful kings ruled the realms of Westeros, men who believed crowns were immovable once placed upon their brows. They had not yet faced me. They did not yet understand what fire could decide. From the top of my hill, I studied the horizon and imagined the battles to come. Harren the Black in his colossal fortress of stone, Argilac the Proud behind the walls of Storm's End, Mern of the Reach with his golden fields behind him, Loren of the Rock with ancient pride at his back. Each one believed himself secure. Each one believed the sea, the mountains, or the sheer size of their armies would shield them. I knew their strengths as well as they did. I knew their weaknesses even better. By the time our encampment had taken form, messengers from the surrounding lands arrived to assess my intent. Some offered false courtesies, others threatened. None left unchanged. They saw not only the dragons, but the unity between my sisters and me. They saw discipline, structure, and purpose where they expected chaos. And as word spread, fear turned into rumor, and rumor into inevitability. The conquest had ignited, and no king could extinguish it. When I stood again at the shoreline where I had first stepped onto Westerosi soil, I looked upon the banner fluttering above my newly built fort and felt a strange calm settle within me. Fire had touched the land for the first time. Not wild, uncontrolled flame, but fire wielded with intention. The hills beneath my feet would grow into a city. The world before me would bend into a single realm. And I, Aegon of House Targaryen, had taken the first irrevocable step toward reshaping Westeros forever. I rode toward Harrenhal, knowing I was approaching the greatest monument to mortal pride ever forged, a fortress so immense that even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing its shadow. Harren the Black had poured the strength of his kingdom into those colossal walls, believing stone alone could deny the passage of time, fate, and fire. As I drew closer, the towers rose above the trident like a challenge etched into the sky. 5 titanic spires clawed upward, wide enough for whole halls to rest inside them, tall enough to darken half the battlefield beneath their silhouettes. Many called Harren mad for building such a monstrous thing. I believed madness was too gentle a word. Only a man blinded by fear and ambition would dare to trap so many lives inside a tomb he mistook for a legacy. Before confronting Harren himself, I spoke with the river lords gathering around me, men who had long suffered beneath his rule. They needed no convincing. Oppression sharpens loyalty faster than gold ever can. With their banners rising beside mine, I approached the gates of Harrenhal and demanded parley. Harren came down dressed in black armor that mirrored the cruelty of the keep behind him. Age had carved deep lines across his face, yet his eyes still held the stubborn fire of a man who believed himself unbreakable. He looked at me, not with curiosity, but with defiance burnished by decades of conquest. Between us, the air felt charged, as if the gods themselves leaned forward to witness the outcome. I offered him a choice: surrender his crown, preserve his line, and spare his people from needless death." Harren laughed, a brittle sound swallowed quickly by the empty field. He gestured toward the looming walls and declared that no dragon could melt stone, no flame could breach the towers that had taken his entire life to construct. He spoke with a pride anchored so deeply that even truth could not dislodge it. I saw then that surrender was impossible. A lifetime of fear had shaped him into a creature who trusted walls more than wisdom. As he turned away, I knew he believed he had already won simply by enduring. But the world had changed, and the age of stone was ending. When night fell, I mounted Balerion, his wings unfurled like a storm tearing itself from the heavens. The sky darkened beneath us as we climbed, the world shrinking into shadows far below. I circled once, twice, feeling the weight of decision settle across my shoulders. This was no simple assault. It was a reckoning born from tyranny and arrogance. The river lords waited below, silent and still, their torches trembling in anticipation. The walls of Harrenhal gleamed faintly under the moon, each tower standing as a monument to the belief that mortals could outbuild destiny. I whispered a word to Balerion, and he answered with a growl that shook my bones. Then we descended. When Balerion opened his jaws, the night itself seemed to ignite. Black flame poured downward, so hot the very air screamed around it. The tower beneath us glowed red, then white, then split as the fire devoured its strength. Harren's soldiers scrambled along the battlements, their silhouettes flickering like shadows trapped in a lantern. I heard their shouts, not in triumph or rage, but in disbelief. The walls they trusted were betraying them. Each stone that had promised safety now radiated heat fierce enough to blister skin before the flames ever touched it. The great towers, built to defy kingdoms, began to sag under their own weight, melting like wax beneath a relentless sun. Inside the keep, chaos erupted. The river lords would later tell me they heard screams echoing through the stone as Harren and his sons perished in the hall they had claimed as their throne. No blade struck them, no arrow flew. Fire alone had judged their legacy. By dawn, the towers of Harrenhal stood warped and hollow, their edges twisted like molten crowns frozen mid-collapse. Smoke clung to the morning light, carrying with it the final remnants of Harren's rule. When I walked through the ruined gates, the river lords followed in solemn silence. They saw what remained of the fortress that had once cast its shadow across their lands, and awe tempered their pride. Harrenhal had not been conquered by siege or strategy. It had been undone by the truth that power founded on cruelty cannot endure. I declared the Riverlands free of Harren's line and granted governance to a house that had earned the loyalty of its people. The choice marked the first true shift in the balance of Westeros, a turning point shaped not by brute force, but by the clarity of purpose. As I looked back at the melted towers, the message carved itself into my memory as clearly as if written in flame. Stone endures only until fire decides otherwise, and on that night, fire rewrote the fate of kingdoms. I marched south toward Storm's End, knowing I was walking into the heart of a kingdom famous for defiance. No fortress in Westeros had earned its legends more honestly than that ancient citadel perched against the fury of the narrow sea. Its walls had endured tempests that tore ships apart like driftwood, and its people carried the same stubborn strength. At their head stood Argilac, last of the Storm Kings, a man forged by battle long before I was born. He was proud, fierce, and utterly convinced that neither dragon nor man could force him to kneel. If Harrenhal had shown me the cost of arrogance carved in stone, Storm's End would show me the cost of pride carved into flesh and will. Argilac refused diplomacy from the moment my first envoys approached him. He saw mercy as weakness, saw alliance as surrender, and saw me not as a future king, but as an invader, trespassing upon land he believed protected by destiny itself. His letters were blunt, his tone contemptuous, and every gesture from his court echoed the certainty that Storm's End had never fallen and therefore never would. I understood his posture. Leaders who grow old on the battlefield believe themselves irreplaceable, but wars are rarely won by age. They are won by adaptation, and Argilac had chained himself to an era the world was already leaving behind. While I gathered my forces, Rhaenys took to the skies with Meraxes, scouting the roads and woods surrounding the Stormlands. Her eyes missed nothing. She reported that Argilac's armies were not massing behind the walls, but moving toward us, choosing to strike first rather than endure a siege. It was a bold choice, though boldness alone does not shape victory. The Storm King believed he could break us before dragons ever joined the field, and he set his hopes on terrain, weather, and sheer numbers. He had every advantage except the one that mattered most. The storm hit at dawn. Rain crashed across the hills in sheets so thick the world seemed carved from water. The ground churned into mud beneath our boots, and every shield felt twice its weight. My commander, Orys Baratheon, a man as steady as the earth itself, positioned our troops along the slopes where the terrain narrowed. I trusted him with that front, for he understood the Stormlands better than any other ally beside me. From the ridgeline, I saw Argilac's banners advancing through the downpour, their colors blurred by distance and rain. Yet even blurred, they moved with purpose. The Storm King rode at their head, lightning reflecting upon his armor as though the sky itself recognized him. The clash that followed was savage, every strike drowned beneath the roar of wind. Argilac's knights charged again and again, only to have their mounts slip in the mire. Spears clattered uselessly. Arrows dissolved into the storm before reaching their marks. My soldiers fought with determination, but the storm favored no one that day. It belonged to chaos, not to strategy. I knew the battle could not turn in our favor by mortal means alone. A storm forged Argilac. Only fire could unmake him. With a single command, Rhaenys dove from the clouds. Meraxes split the storm itself, descending in a torrent of wings and flame. The rain hissed against her breath. Not enough to challenge the inferno she unleashed. Argilac's vanguard buckled beneath the sudden blaze. Horses reared and collapsed. Knights stumbled blind through steam and smoke. The battlefield changed in an instant, reshaped by a force they had never imagined facing. As Meraxes swept low, I saw Argilac wield his steed, refusing to flee even as the world fell apart around him. He charged toward my center with a final cry, eager to meet the end with steel in hand. Orys met him. Their duel cut through the chaos, blades ringing above the dying storm. They fought like men who understood the gravity of the moment, one defending a legacy, the other carving a new one. Argilac struck with the strength of a lifetime spent mastering war, but Orys carried the sharper purpose. When Argilac fell, he fell as a king should, upright and unyielding until the final breath. I honored him for that, even as the Stormlands fractured without his command. Storm's End opened its gates soon after. The last heir of Argilac, a daughter unready for war, chose surrender over the ruin that had consumed so many others. I accepted her submission not with triumph but with acknowledgment of the cost her people had borne. With her consent, Orys Baratheon took her hand in her house's words, forging a new line to rule the Stormlands in my name. It was not conquest alone, but transformation, the forging of a future built from the embers of a kingdom that had fought until it could fight no more. When I looked back on that battle, the storm seemed almost symbolic. Argilac believed tempests would protect him. Instead, they obscured the truth until it was too late to change course. Fire ended what the storm could not. And in that bitter exchange, the last Storm King passed into legend, while the Stormlands passed into my realm. I marched west, knowing the greatest test of my conquest awaited me across those golden plains. The kings of the Reach and the Westerlands, Mern of House Gardner and Loren of House Lannister, had set aside their rivalries long enough to forge a single towering host. Never before had the realm seen such unity between powers so proud, and never had two crowns gathered so enormous an army. Their banners filled the horizon like a forest of spears, their knights gleaming beneath the sun as if they carried daylight on their armor. Some claimed their force numbered 50,000 or more, a tide of steel sweeping toward me with the promise of overwhelming might. Yet, as I watched their approach, I felt no tremor of doubt. I had stood before stone that believed itself immortal. I had faced storms that believed themselves invincible. Both had fallen. The host advancing against me would learn the same truth. My own strength was modest by comparison, scarcely a fraction of their size. The river lords who had sworn fealty marched at my side, loyal but untested against such numbers. I knew courage alone would not turn the tide. I needed clarity, resolve, and the advantage that no mortal army could ever match. As I surveyed the fields stretching out before us, I felt the wind shift, dry and warm against my cheek. The grass rustled like a whispered warning. The fields were ripe, high with wheat and brittle with summer heat. Fire traveled quickly through such tinder, and fire was mine. Before dawn, I climbed into Balerian's saddle. His scales shimmered like obsidian catching starlight, and when he breathed, the air trembled with the weight of unspoken destruction. Visenya and Rhaenys joined me, Vhagar and Meraxes circling above our armies like shadows cast from another world. We did not speak. Words were unnecessary. We had ridden into battle before, but never against an army so vast that even dragons seemed small by comparison. Yet the flames inside us burned with purpose, sharper than fear, brighter than hesitation. The two opposing hosts formed their lines with disciplined precision. Mern's men held the center, a wall of spears and shields forged from generations of Reach training. Loren's knights flanked them, their cloaks the color of molten gold. Their combined strength was a spectacle worthy of song. Even I, who would soon break them, could admit the grandeur of their formation. But armies are not won by beauty. They are won by the truth revealed in the moment steel first meets flame. The battle began with the thunder of hooves. Loren charged first, driving his cavalry toward my lines with devastating momentum. Dust rose behind them in a great billowing cloud, and the earth quaked beneath their advance. I ordered my men to brace, but they did not need to hold for long. I gave the signal, and the sky answered. Balerion plunged downward. Vhagar and Meraxes followed. In that single breath of time, the world changed. Flame erupted across the wheat fields, racing with terrifying speed. The heat swelled into a suffocating wave, and the air shimmered as fire devoured the plains. It was not a battle. It was a transformation of the land itself. What had been golden moments before became a sea of red and black, a churning inferno that swallowed knights and footmen alike. Hoarse screams rose above the roar as armor blistered and men faltered in the choking smoke. The field of fire earned its name not through metaphor, but through the undeniable truth that even the bravest hearts falter beneath the weight of nature unleashed. I watched as the mighty formation fractured. Mern's soldiers, disciplined though they were, found no shelter from the dragon fire sweeping across their ranks. Loren, to his credit, fought to keep his men steady, shouting commands that dissolved into chaos. Yet even kings cannot command the wind, nor can they order flames to spare them. When Balerion unleashed the full breadth of his power, the blaze tore through their central lines, leaving only scorched earth where proud regiments had once stood. Vagar's fire met Merax's flames, and together they carved great arcs of destruction across the battlefield. By the time the inferno ebbed, the truth stood plain. Mern Gardner had fallen, the last of his ancient line swallowed by the chaos his pride had led him into. Loren Lannister, armored and ash-streaked, finally cast aside his sword. The defiance drained from his gaze as he knelt before me, surrounded by the silent remnants of his shattered alliance. I accepted his submission with a steady hand, for the man who survives ruin often becomes more valuable than the one who dies resisting it. When the smoke cleared, the plains lay unrecognizable. The field of fire stretched behind me like a wound across the land, a reminder of what happens when kingdoms stand divided against destiny. In that single day, 2 crowns were broken, 2 realms bent, and the balance of power in Westeros changed forever. Fire had chosen the victor, and the West and the Reach now belonged to me. I turned my gaze northward after the field of fire, knowing the greatest distance still lay ahead of me. The north stretched wider than any other realm, a land shaped by harsh winds and older, deeper customs than the rest of Westeros could comprehend. Its people carried the weight of winters that swallowed entire generations, and its kings ruled not from gold or prosperity but from endurance. Torrhen Stark, the king who held Winterfell, was a man raised in the cold's unyielding grip, and I knew well that pride in the north was carved from a different stone. They did not fear storms, nor did they bend easily beneath new crowns. Yet even the most ancient of walls can crack when fate presses hard enough, and I carried with me the force of fire itself. I marched with the armies of the Riverlands, the Stormlands, the West, and the Reach now bound under my banner. Tens of thousands followed me north as we moved through fertile fields, giving way to harsher soil, where the air grew colder and the winds sharper. Word had already flown ahead of us. The burning of Harrenhal, the fall of Storm's End, the inferno that swallowed the mightiest army the realm had ever seen. These tales reached Torrhen Stark long before my footsteps approached the Trident. I knew he would not dismiss them as rumors. Northern lords understood the gravity of stories carved by blood and truth. They prepared for battle because honor demanded it, even if survival whispered a different counsel. The North gathered at the southern edge of the Neck, an ancient bottleneck of swampland impossible to cross with speed. Torrhen knew the terrain would favor him. Buying time while his bannermen rallied beneath the direwolf sigil, he could have held us there for months had he chosen, but instead he marched south. A boldness I respected, for only a king confident in his cause would choose to face the threat directly rather than hide behind marsh and memory. When I reached the banks of the Trident, I saw his host arrayed across the opposite shore. Their numbers were formidable, ranks deep with soldiers whose expressions held no fear of death. They stood silent and unmoving beneath the gray sky, their cloaks whipping with the wind that smelled faintly of winter. Torrhen Stark rode to their front, a tall figure with solemn eyes carrying the weight of a crown he had not earned through conquest, but through the unbroken lineage of his forebears. I felt the gravity of the moment settle between us like a held breath. My sisters circled above. Vhagar and Meraxes carved vast shadows across the northern ranks. Balerion descended beside me, his wings stirring the river into ripples. Torhen gazed upon the dragons, but did not look away. His face held neither awe nor defiance, only an understanding that ran deeper than pride. The North did not bow out of fear. It bowed only when loss became a certainty too vast to ignore. Before battle could begin, Torhen crossed the trident under a white banner, accompanied only by a few trusted bannermen. The river washed around his boots as he approached me, each step measured, deliberate. I watched him closely, sensing the weight of every mile he had marched to reach this moment. He stopped before me, removed his sword, and laid it at my feet. Then he went further. He fell to one knee, placed his crown upon the ground, and pressed his hand to the earth in surrender. At that instant, the wind shifted across the battlefield. Even the dragons seemed to hold their breath. Torhen's voice was steady when he spoke, acknowledging that the cost of resistance would be the death of every man behind him. He would not sacrifice the North's future for the sake of clinging to a crown he could not defend. His humility did not diminish him. It raised him above every ruler who had fallen before me. In that kneeling figure, I saw not defeat, but a rare kind of wisdom, the clarity to preserve thousands rather than lose all for pride. I accepted his fealty, bidding him rise as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. No jeers, no triumphal cries rose from my host. Even my soldiers felt the solemnity of the moment. Torhen was not conquered. He chose survival over destruction. That choice would shape the realm long after both our names faded from mortal lips. When Torhen returned to his camp, he carried no shame. The North followed him without protest, for they too understood that bending is not the same as breaking. The North remained whole, its people spared from fire, its legacy intact, and in return, my realm gained not a burned ruin or a shattered army, but a kingdom united by respect rather than fear. From that day onward, the realm remembered Torhen Stark by a single name. Some spoke it with mockery, others with admiration, but history, as I witnessed it unfold, carried one undeniable truth. The king who knelt saved his people from a fate written in flame, and by doing so, he secured a place in legend. I turned my attention eastward after the North bent to my rule, knowing the Vale awaited me behind its towering peaks. The Eyrie clung to the side of the giant's lance like a defiant crown, a fortress suspended above the clouds, protected by cliffs so steep and passes so narrow that even the most seasoned generals hesitated to challenge it. Yet, steel walls and mountain heights mattered little when dragons could soar above them. I rode with Visenya toward the Vale, fully aware that no army could march through the bloody gate without suffering heavy losses. The mountains were a maze of peril, but the sky was open and unclaimed. When we reached the foothills, I saw the banners of House Targaryen gathered at the pass, their soldiers forming a defensive line meant to hold against any attacker bold enough to test them. They believed themselves secure, as generations before them had. They had not yet seen the horizon darken beneath dragon wings. Visenya rose first, Vhagar carrying her upward with deliberate force. I followed on Balerion, watching the stunned expressions of the soldiers below as our shadows swept across the stone paths. The Eyrie perched far above, silent and distant, as though observing us with cold curiosity. We did not rush. We ascended slowly, circling higher, until the sky wrapped around us like a mantle. The climb was steady, and each wing beat brought us nearer to the legendary stronghold. As we landed within its courtyard, guards scrambled in alarm, unable to decide whether to lift their swords or flee, and there, in the center of that sudden storm of confusion, stood the boy king, Ronald Arryn, wide-eyed and unafraid. He looked at Visenya first, then at Vhagar, and in a voice trembling more with excitement than fear, he asked if he might soar upon her back. The request broke whatever tension lingered. His mother, Queen Shera Arryn, stepped forward with all the composure she could muster, realizing the truth before her. The Vale could not resist me, not when dragons landed where armies could not reach, not when the sky itself had been taken from them. She surrendered with a grace I respected, and in return I accepted their fealty without bloodshed. Ronald rode Vhagar in 3 great circles around the mountain, laughing as the wind pressed against his cheeks. For the Vale, conquest came not through fire, but through awe. But if the Vale bowed with elegance, Dorne waited with silence sharper than any blade. That southern land of desert and hard sun had always stood apart from the other kingdoms, shaped by heat rather than winter, by endurance rather than abundance. Its princes were proud, its people fiercely independent, and its lands hostile to those who underestimated their resilience. I sent Rhaena south first, for no rider understood the grace of sky and sand as she did. Meraxes carried her over the Red Mountains, across scorched canyons and wind-swept dunes. What she found there was not resistance, but absence. Dorne had not assembled armies to meet her. No banners stood upon their battlements. No soldiers marched below. Castles were deserted, villages emptied, roads abandoned. Where she expected confrontation, she found only shadows and heat. The Dornish did not intend to defeat us with open battle. They intended to deny us the opportunity to fight at all. Their refusal to play the game was their strategy, a quiet defiance sharper than drawn steel. They vanished into the terrain, blending with desert and rock until they became indistinguishable from the land itself. When Rhaenys descended upon Sunspear, she found Princess Maria Martell waiting for her, a woman aged and blind, but unbroken in spirit. Maria did not tremble before the dragon's heat. She told Rhaenys that Dorne did not want war, but neither would it kneel. If I wished to rule them, I would have to burn every inch of their homeland, and even then I would find no victory worth claiming. Her words carried no hatred, only a relentless truth. Dorne would not break, not for fire, not for fear, not for any dream I carried across the narrow sea. Rhaenys returned to me with a heaviness I rarely saw in her, and I understood the task that lay ahead. Conquering Dorne would require more than flame or fear. It would require patience, strategy, and an understanding of people who had built their survival upon denying conquest itself. The Vale had bowed, swift and clean, but Dorne stood in defiance, not with armies but with silence. In their refusal, I sensed the first true challenge not of strength but of endurance, and as I looked south across the desert horizon, I realized the fire that had carried me across kingdoms would soon meet a land that swallowed flame and returned only heat. I stood upon the highest of the 3 hills, overlooking the black water, feeling the wind carry the scent of salt and smoke as if the land itself exhaled in anticipation of what would come next. The conquest had carved its mark across kingdoms and crowns, yet this moment carried a weight unlike any battlefield I had crossed. Victory alone does not make a king, acknowledgement does, and the realm was beginning to understand that its future would be forged not by 7 rulers pulling in 7 directions, but by a single hand steady enough to guide it. The people gathered at the foot of the hill, river lords, stormlanders, westermen, men of the Reach, knights who had once marched against me, now bowing beneath the same banners they had tried to defy. Above them all, Balerion loomed like a living shadow, a reminder that power need not always roar to be felt. I had not chosen Dragonstone or Oldtown or any ancient seat for this moment. I chose the very ground where I had first stepped ashore, where the soil had accepted the weight of my ambition before any man had. The High Septon of Oldtown arrived in solemn procession, flanked by robed attendants who carried the oils of anointing. His eyes held caution, but no fear. He knew what the rest now accepted, that resisting the tide of history does not stop its rise. When he placed the crown upon my head, the sound that rose from the crowd was not a shout but a wave, conviction gathering in strength as it washed across the hillside. In that breath of time, I became Aegon of House Targaryen, the first of my name, king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the first men, lord of the seven kingdoms, protector of the realm. The titles were long, but they signified something simple. For the first time, the continent stood almost united. All save Dorne lay beneath my rule, but even their defiance would not dim the truth of what had been forged here. After the ceremony, when the banners had settled and the murmurs quieted into a hum of expectation, I walked alone across the hilltop. The three hills formed a natural crown of their own around the Blackwater, and as I gazed down upon the wide curve where my fleet had once anchored, I envisioned what this place could become. I saw docks stretching into busy tides, markets rising from the earth, stone roads weaving through neighborhoods of trade and life. I did not want my legacy to sit behind cold walls, nor hide in ancestral keeps carved by others long dead. I wanted a capital born from the world I was shaping, not inherited but created. On that day, I named the place King's Landing, not as a boast, but as a promise. Here, kings would not be chosen by birth alone, but by the weight of duty and the burden of the realm that rested upon their shoulders. A city built from struggle, shaped by fire, and anchored in the moment I first set foot upon Westeros. The Iron Throne came soon after, though its creation was far from ceremonial. I gathered the sword surrendered by defeated foes' steel that had been lifted against me, sharpened in defiance, carried with pride by those who believed their reign secure. I ordered them melted in Balerion's flame, each blade folding into the next until they formed a jagged mass of twisted metal. No elegance softened it, no comfort softened it. I wanted a throne that reminded every ruler who sat upon it, including myself, that power was neither gentle nor guaranteed. The throne's edges cut skin, its ridges pressed against bone, and its weight demanded respect. Those who sought comfort in authority had no place upon it. A king must remain vigilant. A king must remain aware that even victory carries the possibility of downfall. As the foundations of King's Landing took shape, I felt a shift in the realm's air. Where once there had been fear, there was now anticipation. Where there had been division, a fragile unity began to bloom. I worked alongside maesters, craftsmen, and builders, establishing systems of governance that drew from the strengths of each region I had claimed. The lords who had bent the knee were given back their lands, not as trophies but as responsibilities. My rule was not built on destruction but on the promise of a realm stronger together than fractured apart. And though Dorne still stood beyond my grasp, its existence no longer taunted me. A realm is not weakened by a single challenge. It is strengthened by the effort to overcome it. As I watched King's Landing rise from soil and stone, I understood that conquest had merely been the opening act of my reign. The true work, building a realm that could endure beyond my lifetime, was only beginning, and as long as my crown rested upon a throne forged from the swords of those who once opposed me, I would never forget the lesson burned into each twisted blade. A king does not rule by fire alone, but by the resolve to shape a world worthy of the power he holds. And that, my friend, is where the tale of Aegon the Conqueror's rise draws its curtain. A journey that began in exile, carved its path in flame, and finally rooted itself in the soil of a newborn capital. Few stories in the world carry such weight, stories where ambition walks hand in hand with destiny, where kingdoms rise not only from victory, but from the choices that shape them. It is a saga of fire, vision, sacrifice, and resolve, woven so tightly into the bones of Westeros that even centuries cannot loosen its hold. If you found yourself swept into the battles, the triumphs, the griefs, and the quiet moments in between, then you already know why this legend endures. It is more than war, more than power. It is the beginning of everything that would one day become the world of thrones, crowns, betrayals, and dragons we all know so well. Now I turn to you. What moved you most in this story? Which moment struck you deepest? Was it the melted towers of Harrenhal, the blazing wheat fields, the wisdom of the king who knelt, or the unbreakable pride of Dorne? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which part of this great tale burned brightest in your imagination. Your voice completes the story.